Imagine finding out that something you have done every single day for the last 50 years, specifically because you wanted to be careful, responsible, healthy, has been quietly depositing toxins into your tissues so gradually that no standard blood test has ever flagged it. Not your annual checkups, not your routine labs, not even the doctor who told you everything looked fine. Because this kind of damage does not announce itself. It accumulates, silently, over decades. And by the time symptoms appear, the exposure has often been building for 30, 40, 50 years. Stay with me, because at the end of this video, I am going to give you the one specific test most physicians never order. It is not expensive, it is not experimental, and it is the only test that actually measures what 50 years of low-level environmental exposure has done inside your body. I am also going to give you the exact questions to ask your doctor before you leave that appointment. But first, the 9 signs. My name is Dr. Monty Fisher. I have spent over 2 decades working in environmental medicine with adults over 55, which means I sit with patients who have done everything right, eaten well, exercised, taken their medications, attended every checkup, and are still getting worse year by year with no explanation that satisfies any of us. What I am about to share is something I now discuss with every patient before we talk about dosing adjustments or new prescriptions. Because in my clinical experience, what is sitting inside someone's body from decades of ordinary environmental exposure is often doing more damage than anything on their standard lab panel. The research I will draw on today comes from the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, the federal body that publishes the definitive toxicological profiles for every compound I will name, as well as peer-reviewed studies published in Environmental Health Perspectives, the American Journal of Epidemiology, scientific reports, and data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which is the largest ongoing biomonitoring program in the United States. Before I give you the 9 signs, you need to understand what is actually happening inside your body. Because without this, everything I am about to say will sound like fear. It is not. It is chemistry. Think of your body as a filtration system that has been running for 50 or 60 years. In your 20s, those filters are clean and efficient. Your liver detoxifies well, your kidneys clear efficiently, and your body handles the chemical load of modern life without visible crisis. But something has been happening in the background that almost no one accounts for. Certain compounds cannot be flushed. Fat-soluble chemicals, persistent organic pollutants, heavy metals like lead and cadmium do not leave. They bind to fatty tissue. They deposit in bone. They accumulate in the kidneys. And they do this so gradually at such low daily concentrations that the body never mounts a visible alarm response. Here is the mechanism that changes everything for adults over 50. Lead is chemically similar to calcium. Your skeleton absorbs it the same way it absorbs calcium, and stores it for years to decades. According to published bone toxicokinetics research, the half-life of lead in bone is in the range of years to decades depending on bone type, with bulk turnover of compact bone proceeding at approximately 2% per year. Nearly 95% of the total lead burden in the body resides in the skeleton. Which means lead deposited in your bones in your 20s and 30s can re-enter your bloodstream as you age, because bone density declines after 50, and as it does, it releases what it has been holding. Research from the Normative Aging Study confirmed that increased bone resorption rate, the process of bone mineral loss during aging, is directly associated with higher mobilization of lead from bone back into the bloodstream. The skeleton is not an inert storage site. It is an active, ongoing source of endogenous re-exposure decades after the original external source is gone. After 50, three things change simultaneously. First, your body's primary internal detoxification compound, glutathione, declines measurably with age. Research published in the journal Redox Biology at Oregon State University's Linus Pauling Institute and confirmed by a 2023 systematic review in Neuroimage Clinical shows that glutathione levels in blood and tissues decline progressively with age, with animal studies documenting approximately a 30% reduction in tissue glutathione concentrations in older subjects compared to younger ones, meaning your liver's capacity to neutralize what it has been accumulating is reduced at the same time accumulation peaks. Second, fat redistribution and mobilization shifts with age, releasing stored fat-soluble compounds back into circulation. Third, kidney filtration rate, called GFR, declines naturally after 40, meaning these compounds stay in the bloodstream longer than they did when you were 35. Standard blood tests were designed to detect acute poisoning, a sudden, large exposure. They are not designed, and were never designed, to detect this kind of slow, decades-long accumulation at subclinical concentrations. That is not a failure of medicine. It is simply the difference between acute toxicology and chronic environmental medicine. They are different disciplines asking different questions. 9 signs are already showing up in your body. Most people have been told they are just getting older. Let me tell you about a patient I will call Mary Jane. 67 years old, retired school librarian, non-smoker her entire adult life. She ate carefully, always had. She walked every morning, attended her checkups without fail, took her vitamins, and managed her blood pressure with one medication her cardiologist prescribed 8 years prior. Her blood panels, every single year, clean. Kidney function, normal. Thyroid, normal. Cholesterol, in range. Her cardiologist told her she was doing everything right. What Mary Jane had been living with for 11 years. Fatigue so complete that sleeping 8 hours left her no more rested than sleeping 4. A tingling in both feet that 3 different neurologists attributed to age-related changes and left untreated. Blood pressure that kept creeping upward despite 3 separate medication adjustments. And a cognitive heaviness she described to me as thinking through wet cement. Words she had always owned, suddenly unreachable. Concentration that slipped. A version of herself she kept trying to get back to. Every test her doctors ordered. Normal. When I ordered a specific heavy metals panel, not a standard blood draw, which only reflects very recent exposure, but a provoked urine collection, her results told a different story entirely. We will come back to Mary Jane. I am presenting these from least to most urgent, from the symptoms most routinely dismissed to the ones the research literature most directly and consistently connects to measurable toxic body burden. Sign 9. Fatigue that does not resolve with sleep. Not ordinary tiredness, not the fatigue after a hard week. The specific kind where you sleep 8 hours and wake up with nothing in reserve. Where rest does not restore you. Where you feel depleted by noon on days when nothing has happened. Here is the mechanism. Heavy metals, particularly arsenic, mercury, and cadmium, directly interfere with mitochondrial function. Your mitochondria are the energy-producing structures inside every cell in your body. They run on a chain of enzymatic reactions, several of which are disrupted by heavy metal interference. Lead and arsenic, for example, inhibit enzymes in the electron transport chain, the final stage of cellular energy production. The result is not a lack of sleep. It is a failure to produce adequate cellular energy regardless of how much sleep occurs. This is why this pattern of fatigue typically does not improve with rest alone and often baffles physicians whose thyroid, iron, and B12 panels come back within normal limits. The disruption is occurring upstream of those tests, at the cellular level, not the hormonal one. Sign 8. Brain fog, word retrieval difficulty, and progressive memory lapses. The pattern matters here. Not forgetting where you put your keys. The deeper experience, losing a word mid-sentence that you have used thousands of times. Reading a paragraph and having it slide off. Beginning a thought and arriving nowhere. Lead deposits in the brain, specifically in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, the regions governing memory, executive function, and language retrieval. It does not clear from neural tissue the way it clears from the blood. Because lead mimics calcium in neuronal signaling, it disrupts the electrochemical communication between neurons at a fundamental level, not destroying them acutely, but degrading their function chronically over years. NHANES-based research, including studies published in scientific reports examining hundreds of elderly American adults, has found consistent associations between combined blood levels of lead, cadmium, and mercury, and reductions in cognitive performance scores, including verbal learning and executive function tests, in adults over 60 after controlling for age, education, BMI, and known medical conditions. The exposure happened years or decades ago. The cognitive effect accumulates in the interim. Sign 7. Tingling, numbness, or burning in both hands and both feet. This is one of the most consistently misattributed symptoms in adults over 55. The standard explanations offered are diabetic neuropathy, vitamin B12 deficiency, or poor circulation. For a clinically significant subset of patients, the actual mechanism is toxic neuropathy, and it goes undiagnosed because the right test is never ordered. Arsenic is a direct neurotoxin. The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry explicitly recognizes a symmetrical stocking glove peripheral neuropathy as the classic presentation of chronic low-level arsenic exposure. Burning or numbness beginning in the feet and working upward, bilateral, affecting both extremities equally. It is sensory in the early stages, tingling, pins and needles, and can progress to motor involvement if exposure continues. The critical distinction most physicians miss: blood arsenic is cleared extremely rapidly from the bloodstream. The ATSDR states that 90% of absorbed arsenic is cleared from blood within the first 2 to 3 hours of exposure. This means a standard blood arsenic draw at any routine clinic visit will almost always read normal, even in someone with documented chronic accumulation. Chronic arsenic body burden requires a 24-hour urine collection for speciated inorganic arsenic, a test that is rarely ordered outside of environmental or occupational medicine practice. Sign 6. Persistent joint pain and unexplained systemic inflammation. Persistent organic pollutants, a class of fat-soluble industrial compounds, including PCBs, certain pesticide residues, and dioxins, do not metabolize in the human body. They accumulate in adipose tissue and in the liver, where they continuously stimulate inflammatory signaling pathways, releasing pro-inflammatory cytokines that circulate through the body and drive chronic, low-grade inflammation across multiple organ systems simultaneously. Published research has found consistent associations between higher serum persistent organic pollutant concentrations and elevated systemic inflammatory markers, including C-reactive protein, which is a primary driver of joint degradation over time. The pattern worth identifying: joint inflammation that standard anti-inflammatory medications do not fully control, that affects multiple joints simultaneously without the localizing distribution of classical osteoarthritis, and that is accompanied by elevated CRP or ESR without a definitive autoimmune diagnosis. This is not rheumatoid arthritis. This is chemically mediated systemic inflammation, and it responds to a different clinical approach. Sign 5. Weight that resists diet and exercise after 50. This one carries research that is now substantial and which mainstream clinical medicine has been slow to integrate. Endocrine-disrupting chemicals, BPA from plastic containers and food packaging, phthalates from personal care products and plastic-wrapped food, organochlorine pesticides that accumulate in conventional produce and animal fats, deposit in adipose tissue, and directly interfere with thyroid hormone conversion and with insulin receptor sensitivity. They compete with your body's own hormones for receptor binding sites. The result is a functional state that resembles both subclinical hypothyroidism and insulin resistance, even when TSH, T4, and fasting glucose panels come back within the standard reference range. The interference is occurring at the receptor level, below the resolution of those tests. Meta-analyses and multiple longitudinal studies have found consistent associations between persistent organic pollutant body burden and insulin resistance that hold after controlling for caloric intake and physical activity. This is why some patients who are disciplined, who track their food, who exercise consistently, cannot shift weight after 55. They are not failing to apply effort. The hormonal signaling at the receptor level has been chemically altered. Sign 4. Blood pressure that keeps requiring additional medication. This carries the strongest and most consistent research support of any sign on this list, and it is the least known to patients. Lead directly impairs vascular function through a specific, well-documented mechanism. It inhibits the enzyme responsible for producing nitric oxide, the compound your blood vessels require to dilate, relax, and regulate pressure. Research from the Normative Aging Study, published in environmental medicine journals, confirmed that lead decreases nitric oxide bioavailability by increasing reactive oxygen species production, creating arterial rigidity and sustained vasoconstriction. And because lead also deposits in the wall of the aorta itself, human autopsy studies have confirmed age and dose-dependent aortic lead deposition. The structural flexibility of the vascular system is directly and physically compromised. NHANES-based research encompassing thousands of adults has found consistent associations between blood lead levels, bone lead accumulation, and hypertension risk, with lead identified as the predominant metal contributor among those studied. The Normative Aging Study specifically examined bone lead concentrations and resistant hypertension, defined as blood pressure that remains uncontrolled on 3 medications or requires 4 or more medications to manage, and found that higher bone lead was significantly associated with elevated resistant hypertension risk. Of 475 study participants examined, 97 cases, 20.4%, met criteria for resistant hypertension. If your blood pressure has required multiple medication adjustments over the years, and the standard explanations of salt, stress, and weight do not fully account for the trajectory, lead body burden is a medically documented and research-supported contributing mechanism that is almost never investigated in routine cardiology. Sign 3. Unusual skin changes, irregular pigmentation, palm or sole thickening, or slow-healing wounds. Arsenic has a specific chemical affinity for keratin, the protein that makes up your skin, hair, and nails. Chronic low-level arsenic accumulation produces 2 characteristic dermatological changes that are recognized by both toxicologists and the ATSDR as indicators of chronic exposure. The first is hyperpigmentation, irregular darkening of the skin, often in a raindrop or mottled pattern, appearing on the trunk and extremities. The second is palmar-plantar hyperkeratosis, a progressive thickening of the skin, specifically on the palms and soles, that is frequently attributed to callousing or aging. The ATSDR's clinical assessment module explicitly describes these skin lesions, alongside peripheral neuropathy, as the most suggestive effects of chronic arsenic exposure, and states that their presence should prompt an aggressive search for an arsenic etiology. These changes develop slowly over years, which is precisely why they are not connected to their cause by patients or physicians. They appear unremarkable until you know what to look for. If a dermatologist has attributed these changes to aging or sun exposure, and you have ever relied on well water, lived in a rural area, consumed significant quantities of rice over decades, or worked in agriculture, construction, or any industry involving pressure-treated wood, this sign warrants a specific arsenic test. Sign 2. White horizontal bands across your nails, or progressive nail changes. This is the most diagnostically specific sign on this list. It is textbook toxicology, and it is routinely missed in clinical practice because it is simply not looked for. Mace's lines, also known as Aldrich-Mace's lines, are white horizontal bands that run across the nail plate, parallel to the base. They form when arsenic disrupts normal keratin production in the nail matrix during a period of elevated systemic accumulation, leaving a visible band that grows outward as the nail grows. Because fingernails grow at approximately 3 millimeters per month, the position of a Mace line from the nail base can be used to approximate when the disruption occurred. This is documented in standard medical reference texts, including the NCBI's Case Studies in Environmental Medicine series. Published clinical case literature has documented that chronic arsenic exposure, including from contaminated drinking water, presents with exactly this nail finding alongside the peripheral neuropathy and skin changes already described. In multiple documented cases, blood arsenic levels were normal at the time of clinical presentation, while 24-hour urinary arsenic confirmed ongoing systemic accumulation. Blood arsenic, as I noted earlier, reflects only hours of exposure. Nail arsenic, like hair arsenic, reflects weeks to months of accumulated deposition. If you have white horizontal banding or progressive nail changes that have been attributed to aging, do not dismiss it. Ask for a 24-hour speciated urinary arsenic test. Sign 1. The triad: cognitive slowing, treatment-resistant cardiovascular changes, and unexplained fatigue occurring together. Every sign I have described so far carries a plausible alternative explanation in isolation. That is exactly why each one goes uninvestigated. But when a patient over 55 presents simultaneously with all three, progressive cognitive difficulties, cardiovascular changes that resist standard management, and fatigue that does not resolve, while standard blood panels continue to read within normal limits, the published research in environmental medicine identifies this convergence as a clinical pattern warranting investigation for elevated heavy metal body burden. Multiple peer-reviewed analyses using NHANES data, including research examining elderly American adults published in Scientific Reports and Frontiers in Public Health, have found that combined blood levels of lead, cadmium, and mercury are consistently and independently associated with reductions in cognitive performance and elevations in cardiovascular disease markers in adults over 60. A 2024 study in Frontiers in Public Health found that combined lead, cadmium, and mercury exposure was associated with systemic inflammation, a mechanism that drives cognitive decline, cardiovascular disease, and metabolic fatigue simultaneously. The convergence of these three symptoms is the signal. Your body is not failing in three separate systems randomly. Multiple organ systems are being affected by the same underlying mechanism. The reason the standard panel misses it is that the standard panel was never designed to ask this question. Blood metals testing for chronic accumulation requires a different methodology, and a physician who knows which question to ask. One sign is noise. Three signs from this list presenting together is a pattern the research literature treats as a clinical signal worth investigating. How many of these 9 signs did you recognize in yourself? Type the number in the comments. Not for a diagnosis, but because that number is the beginning of a conversation you need to have with a physician who asks different questions. If you have stayed this far, you are clearly invested. And what comes next is where this video becomes actionable. But most viewers engage with content like this and scroll away without subscribing, and then they miss everything that follows. If this video means something to you, if any of those 9 signs made you pause, tap subscribe. It takes 1 second. If not, you will likely forget this channel exists and miss the follow-up video I am releasing in the next 2 weeks on what environmental medicine physicians actually recommend for patients with confirmed elevated body burden. I promised I would come back to Mary Jane. 3 months after we identified elevated levels of lead and arsenic on her provoked urine panel, the test that finally asked the right question, and implemented the specific protocol I am about to describe, something shifted. The fatigue she described as a decade-long ceiling began to lift. The tingling in her feet, which 3 neurologists had dismissed for 11 years, decreased substantially. And for the first time in 4 years, her blood pressure stabilized on her existing medication without requiring another adjustment. Her words at our follow-up: "Why did nobody think to look for this in 11 years of testing?" That is the gap. The research exists. The tests are available. The protocols are documented in the peer-reviewed literature. But the 15-minute appointment is not structured to ask, what has accumulated in this person's body over 50 years of ordinary life? That is what this channel is for. Let me bring this all together. 9 signs your body may be carrying decades of accumulated toxic burden. Fatigue that sleep does not resolve. Brain fog and progressive word retrieval difficulty. Bilateral tingling or burning in the hands and feet. Persistent multi-joint inflammation without a clear diagnosis. Weight that resists all intervention after 50. Unusual skin pigmentation or thickening on palms or soles. White horizontal banding or progressive changes on your nails. Blood pressure that keeps requiring more medication. The triad: cognitive, cardiovascular, and fatigue symptoms occurring simultaneously while your standard labs remain normal. Start here. Ask your physician for a provoked urine heavy metals panel, not a standard blood draw. As the ATSDR confirms, blood arsenic clears within hours. Blood lead only reflects recent acute exposure and does not capture the decades of bone-stored lead that is your actual body burden. Ask specifically for a 24-hour urinary speciated inorganic arsenic collection and urine or blood panels for lead, mercury, and cadmium. If your physician is unfamiliar with this test, the phrase to use is, "I would like to discuss a referral for evaluation of chronic heavy metal body burden." The American Board of Environmental Medicine certifies physicians who ask these questions every day. Start with whichever step feels most actionable. 1 question asked consistently is worth more than 5 symptoms ignored repeatedly. Which of these 9 signs did you recognize in yourself? Tell me in the comments right now. I read every one. And if you know someone over 60 who has been told for years that their tests are normal while they keep getting worse, share this with them. That share may be the most useful thing you do for their health today. Everything shared in this video is general educational information based on published research in environmental medicine, toxicology, and epidemiology, including material from the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, the Normative Aging Study, and peer-reviewed academic journals. It is not a substitute for personal medical advice, and no part of this video should be used to self-diagnose or alter your current medical care. If you are managing cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, neuropathy, cognitive changes, or any of the conditions discussed today, please speak with your physician before making any changes. If you are concerned about toxic body burden, please seek evaluation from a licensed medical professional with training in environmental or occupational medicine. This video is a starting point for that conversation, not a replacement for it.